Let me, in our last segment, bring you up to date that we're talking with Dr. Frank Smith, who is the creator. He helped to establish the National Memorial for the African American Civil War Memorial. This goes, the dedication was 1998.
Right.
And let's talk, this is a short segment, but this controversy involving Confederate soldiers, African Americans who served in the Confederate Army. What did your museum address that? Are any of your soldiers who served in the Confederate Army part of this museum? How did you handle that controversy?
Okay, Joe, let me say that our names were obtained from the records of the National Archives. The National Archives has named 6.6 million names of all of the Union and Confederate soldiers and the African American soldiers, which is where we got ours from. There are no African American soldiers listed among the Confederate soldiers. There were no African American soldiers who were actually enlisted in any Confederate regiments. Now, it's interesting how that story has stayed around for all these years. This notion that some black people loved slavery enough so they were willing to take up arms to fight to defend slavery, which is really what the Confederates was trying to do. So there were no blacks. Now, let me just hasten to add that they were all of the slaves were aiding the Confederacy up until Lincoln freed them. And I gave you an example of one of them, Robert Smalls, earlier. Robert Smalls was actually aiding the Confederate. He was working on a Confederate ship. That's what his job was, to show them how to get in and out of the harbor. He was guiding a Confederate naval ship that was attacking the Union Army. But he was also trying to figure out. Now, Robert Smalls was not listed as a Confederate Navy person. Okay, he was like Halliburton is on these. We got private people working on these ships now, and ripping the government off too, by the way. But there weren't any blacks.
Show.
Yeah,
right.
But there weren't any blacks in the Confederate Army. So how does it miss? How do you kill a lie that's been out there for all these years? I think the reason why this story stays around is because I think that the South does not want to admit that they owned slaves and treated these people so poorly that they separated families, they killed people, they raped and pillaged and stole their labor for all these years, for which they paid them absolutely nothing. They don't want to admit that slavery was a horrible institution, so they invented this myth that it was not only was it not so horrible, but good enough so that blacks would join the Union Army, the Confederate Army.
So let's go back to something you said at the beginning of this segment. Again, officially, you get all the names from the National Archives of both Union and Confederate soldiers.
Absolutely.
There you find obviously the names of the African Americans who enlisted.
Right.
But when you looked at the Confederate roster,
there were no names
of African Americans. Right. So, but they were there aiding Confederates because they were slaves.
They were all doing what slaves do. They were growing the food. They were helping to build. I told you the story about the guy on my board.
Right.
They were helping to build the fortifications around Vicksburg.
Right.
And that's what the Confederates needed them to do. They didn't really need them on the front line. First of all, they weren't going to arm them anyway, because they knew if they armed them as slaves, they couldn't trust them. First of all, and then secondly, there is an official record here of discussion about blacks being in the Confederate Army. It takes place in March of 1865, when the Confederacy votes to let blacks into the Confederate Army. But even in that case, they were only going to allow blacks who were free into the Confederate Army. Nobody was talking about arming the slaves. They were talking about arming free blacks.
Did blacks engage in combat on behalf of the Confederacy during the Civil War? Was anyone were they able to find that?
Well, let me say, there's no record of them ever having been enlisted in the Confederate Army. Now I have seen documents. I'm a museum now. People bring me all kind of things. I have seen one letter from a lady saying that where her grandfather was given a document from his slave owner saying, "If you help me win this war, I will free you." And now that was probably something that took place between an individual and his slave owner. It would have been worth whatever it was worth that the war was over and the Confederacy had won. I do know this: if the Confederacy Robert E. Lee and the Confederacy had won this war, slavery would have lasted in the United States for another 50 or 60 years, maybe 100 years. We don't know how long it would have lasted.